right, hey guys, and welcome back. Welcome back. There we go. Last time we were introducing this new era in the late 1800s after Reconstruction called the Gilded Age, which is going to take us from the 1870s up through the 1890s, early 1900s. In the Gilded Age, remember that you have the second industrial revolution gripping America and huge industrial changes taking place as America's economy really grows. Part of this was due to a variety of factors we had discussed last time. Remember that some of those factors included a growing supply of labor in the form of millions of immigrants that are going to be coming over, abundant natural resources, an expanding market for manufactured goods as we begin to imperialize and make colonies just as European countries were at this time, and the availability of capital or money for investment, as well as a federal government that was enacting high tariffs, promoting and protecting American businesses from foreign competition, granting lands to railroad companies, and using the military to remove Native Americans from Western lands that were desired by farmers and mining companies. You also have many new inventions during the Gilded Age, which will be contributing to this American prosperity, question mark, including the invention of the Atlantic cable, the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell, the typewriter, handheld cameras, and from the prolific inventor / remember Menlo Park, his invention factory, Thomas Edison, you have the phonograph, the light bulb, motion pictures, and most importantly, electricity, a system for generating and distributing electric power, the current wars we talked about. There's also many other inventions that were coming to fruition and coming full circle at this time. Agriculturally speaking, the steel plow will be very important for many of those homestead farmers out on the plains with that rough soil. From John Deere. John Deere with the tractors will eventually become very important, but he started off with the steel plow, which is going to be a lot easier to get into that really tough soil than, say, an iron plow was. You'll also have, agriculturally speaking, the McCormick reaper, which this reaping device was used to basically auto harvest a crop instead of having to do it by hand, which is going to make, again, a lot of farm boys obsolete. Where are they going to go? They're going to migrate to the cities. And so there was lots of new inventions at this time. Okay. And as far as the way that business was going, it's also going to be changing as well. This is the era of the robber barons. So let's talk about those guys. All right. Competition is really fierce at this time. It's also very volatile. The combination of a market flooded with goods and the federal monetary policies that removed money from the national economy led to a relentless fall in prices. The world economy suffered prolonged downturns in the 1870s, like the Panic of 1873, and it's going to go through several in the 1890s. So it's got periods where it's doing real good and booming, and then it kind of crashes and lots of people lose lots of money. And it goes through this many times in the late 1800s. Businesses engaged in ruthless competition at this time. Railroads and other companies try various means of bringing order to the chaotic marketplace. They formed pools that divided up markets between supposedly competing firms and fixed prices. Like a fixed price, everybody's saying, hey, we're all going to set our product at this price. No matter what business you're in, no matter what company, let's all have the same prices so that they could drive up the prices and get more money. They established trusts. Now, please highlight this word in your notes. Please make sure you understand it. A trust was a legal device where the affairs of several rival companies were managed by a single director. It's almost like forming what's called a monopoly. Now, if you've ever played the game Monopoly before, you know how not the symbol, oh my gosh, the mascot. I don't know what you call him, but the mascot of the Monopoly games. He's this dude with the top hat and the monocle and stuff. He's supposed to be like a Gilded Age guy, a Gilded Age businessman. And that's what a captain of industry / a robber baron was, a Gilded Age business person. But basically, a monopoly is where you have one company take control of an entire industry. So when I say the word trust, it's almost sort of like a monopoly. And remember, in the game, the board game Monopoly, the objective is to own as many properties as possible. That's you're cornering the market. You're taking over as much as possible. That's forming a monopoly. A trust is kind of like forming a monopoly. Okay, and railroad companies were the first to establish these monopolistic interests, these trusts. Let's go. Let's talk about Andrew Carnegie first. Andrew Carnegie. Let me move my face here. There we go. Kind of okay. Andrew Carnegie was a poor Scottish immigrant who came to the United States when he was, I think, around 12, maybe even a little bit younger with his family. His father was out of the picture when he was very young, so little Andrew had to intern at a railroad company from a very young age, like I said, 12, in order to help provide for his mother and siblings. And he worked his way up through the railroad company, getting mentored and everything else. And eventually, Andrew Carnegie was able to kind of become his own railroad leader. And with the railroads, he was famous for the construction of this massive railroad bridge across the Mississippi River, one of the first ones. And in doing so, to make such a huge bridge, because the Mississippi River in some places, it's over a mile across, like it's enormous, enormous river, right? To do this, he realized that iron was not going to be good enough for this bridge. Wood was not going to be good enough. It would need something stronger. And this is where Carnegie starts to focus his interests less on the railroads and more about what made them. More about what made the tracks, because most railroads, most rails used to be made out of iron. But the problem with iron is that it's brittle. It easily rusts and weakens, and it doesn't last that long, especially since it is continuously out in the elements. And so Carnegie is going to begin to find a way to try to make steel. Steel is far more durable, longer lasting, and stronger than iron is. But the problem was it was really hard to make steel. That's why in the mid 1800s, the most steel you would find would be like in the form of silverware, such as forks and knives, maybe made out of steel. Or you might even have people wearing steel jewelry because it was such a difficult substance to create. You'd have to superheat the iron ore basically into a molten state and then find a way to quickly mold it before it hardened. And that was just too difficult to do on a large enough scale to make giant structures like rails out of. And that's where Carnegie, scouring the world over for a better process to make steel, comes across the English scientist Henry Bessemer. And Andrew Carnegie, this Scottish born American immigrant, and the English scientist Henry Bessemer, what they're going to do is going to change the landscape of the world. Because the Bessemer process that they're going to use is going to successfully, efficiently make steel, make a whole bunch of it and make it a lot cheaper than ever before. That's a picture of the Bessemer furnace right there. It's I'm not a scientist. It's basically the most simplest way I can explain it is that you get the iron ore, it superheats it into the molten iron ore state, and then you pour this molten iron ore into the cast iron, and then you form it and you shape it and whatever. And it's about how they oxidize it. I'm not going to go into it, but the Bessemer process is super important. Okay. This is how Andrew Carnegie is able to mass produce steel. And when you can mass produce it, now you can use steel for more than just, forks and knives and jewelry. You can use it to make beams for railroads. You can have the entire, remember we talked about last time, how many rails are being built, thousands of miles for tracks all across America. Now they're going to be built out of steel and they'll be lasting. Now you can also have buildings and structures like his bridge across the Mississippi, and buildings tall enough to reach the skies. Oh, what do we call those? Skyscrapers, all because of the Bessemer process. And Andrew Carnegie becomes incredibly successful with his steel. He builds an entire steel company, Carnegie Steel, using the vertical integration process. Vertically and horizontally integrating is referring to how you monopolize an industry, how your one company takes over an entire field of business, in this case, the steel business. And so to vertically take over an industry like that, that means owning the process at every stage of production, from when you get that substance from the land to when you manufacture it, to when you store it, to when you distribute it. So for steel, this would be Andrew Carnegie literally taking ownership of the mining companies and owning the mines where you mine for iron ore from the mountains and stuff. And then owning the steel mills. He had a huge steel mill operation in Homestead Steel in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which will be the capital of the ironworks for the United States for the steel making industry. Homestead Steel is plant there. And then you own the distribution companies that sell the steel to the railroads and whatnot. And so that's the vertical integration process of making a monopoly. Now, he was born a poor immigrant who hadn't even been able to receive a formal education past the 8th grade, were it not for like his mentors that took him under wing in the railroad companies where he started off as a kid working. So he had very humble beginnings. And really, this is the American dream being born right here. When you have these poor boys who rise up from nothing to dominate industries and help propel America's economy, we call them the captains of industry. That these men were the men who built America, who helped make our economy one of the greatest in the world at this time. And going along with this idea of a great business leader, because the business leaders during the Gilded Age were actually more important and had more influence than the government, which assisted them and stood by the way and let them do all this stuff at this time. Keep in mind that the federal government during the Gilded Age, basically stepping out of the way, letting these businesses consolidate and form trust and take over each other and form monopolies, which hurt workers and which hurt consumers. The federal government was extremely laissez-faire. Laissez-faire, or the hands-off approach, it means that you basically let business do what it wants. You being the government, you stay out of the affairs of business. You do not regulate. And so this unregulated, basically business acumen that was going at this time produced these men, these captains of industry. And another reason why they would be known in such a positive way as a captain of industry is that a lot of these businessmen, like Andrew Carnegie, they donated a lot of their wealth to charities. This is known as philanthropy, when you give back to those less fortunate. And so a lot of Andrew Carnegie's charity work was donating millions of his own personal wealth to schools and colleges, but especially libraries. Since he didn't have a formal schooling past the 8th grade, Carnegie really valued libraries and donated so much money that he almost was able to build a public library in every county of America and in many places around the world. He also really loved to golf and helped establish a lot of the Scottish Golfing League, I believe, or definitely some very famous Scottish golfing tours, which Trump has been all about during his presidency. And the last thing I'm going to say about Andrew Carnegie, this Scottish immigrant, is he will eventually sell off his company, his monopoly, Carnegie Steel, to the notorious businessman slash captain of industry robber baron, a guy named J.P. Morgan, for $1 billion. And JP Morgan will turn Carnegie Steel into US Steel, the first $1 billion industry. Well, first $1 billion business, I should say. Now, Carnegie isn't all sunshine and rainbows. He builds this massive steel empire with the Bessemer process. And he donates a lot to charity, but at the same time, he is also taking advantage of his workers. He had extremely dictatorial practices. He ran his factories almost nonstop with 2 12-hour shifts every single day of the year, except the 4th of July. And there will be brutal repercussions for this. because of how hard he worked his employees, and oftentimes left the actual running to underlings. There will be a massive strike at Homestead Steel between skilled and unskilled workers, the Homestead Steel strike, which will result in an actual armed clash between some of his factory workers and members of a private militia force that were hired to stop their strike, a group known as the Pinkertons. They were like a mercenary force for hire. Pinkertons also, by the way, served as one of the first Secret Service for President Lincoln during the Civil War. But more on that later. So that is Andrew Carnegie. Please remember that he is a captain of industry with the steel empire that he builds. He used the vertical integration process to build his giant Carnegie Steel Company. And while being a captain of industry meant that he did donate a lot of his money to philanthropies such as, for building of libraries, he was also terrible in the sense that he took advantage of many of his workers. And when you are a businessman who takes advantage of their workers and causes a lot of misery in that sense, and ruthlessly you cut out the competition, you are known as a robber baron, which is why it's time to switch over to talking about the most famous of all American businessmen during the Gilded Age, Mr. John D. Rockefeller, the richest man in America. Before there was Bill Gates, before there was Steve Jobs, before there was Jeff Bezos, there was John D. Rockefeller. And Rockefeller, like Carnegie, started off extremely poor. His father didn't die. John D. Rockefeller's father was a con man who basically up and left the family when Rockefeller was very small. And just like Carnegie, Rockefeller, he wasn't born an immigrant traveling to America, but born in Ohio. He had to take care of his mom and siblings on his own, and eventually he ends up basically joining with the railroad companies, doing some other stuff. And he comes across the idea, because all great entrepreneurs, they have a vision and they follow through, and that's how they make their money, right? They see a niche where they can earn money, what the future will be, they predict it, right? And they cash in. His niche, he finds, is with the oil industry. Now, in the late 1800s, oil was not as important as it is today. Because remember, the car does not come about until really Henry Ford starts using the assembly line for mass production by 1913. Before then, there were cars, but they were extremely expensive, custom made. Really, you could only own one if you were exceptionally rich. And so most oil was used for the railroads. And so what Rockefeller did was he didn't capitalize on the drilling of oil. He's going to get in at the refining stage. And a lot of oil at this time that wasn't used for railroads, it was used in the form of kerosene instead of gasoline. And you would refine oil into this kerosene to use for the lighting of lanterns. There were other ways to provide lighting before electricity, before Thomas Edison and his giant company, General Electric. We talked about last time, the current wars. General Electric was Edison's big company, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that. But the most common way was kerosene. It was much cleaner burning than, like, say, whale fat and other stuff. Plus, it was easier to get. And so kerosene was the major way that lanterns were lit. And lanterns were most of the way you had lighting at night on streets and houses and et cetera. And so he gets on in the refining stage, becomes one of the best refiners. And then he starts to create his own vertical integration model for monopolizing the oil industry. Remember how Carnegie monopolized the steel industry, working his way up. Rockefeller's going to do that with oil. So he starts off with the refining stage, and then he's eventually going to buy out many of the oil fields where oil was drilled, making the oil into kerosene and eventually gasoline at his refineries, and then owning the storage facilities, and then owning like the gas stations. So owning it at every stage. He also, though, was famous for using the other method of monopolization known as the horizontal integration method. And that is where you buy out the competition. And so Rockefeller was very famous for making backdoor deals with railroad companies, saying, hey, if you ship my oil, I'll offer you a slightly lower price than the competition. Doing price fixing to where he would sell his oil for just slightly less than whatever the competition was selling it for. And then as soon as the competition went out of business, he bought them up and then he jacked up the prices. All sorts of things like that was what made Rockefeller's oil company, known as Standard Oil, the biggest, most brazenly terrible monopoly in American history. Up to that point, there have been some since. And so Standard Oil, this giant monopoly, is famously pictured in like political cartoons, such as the one you can see here, as like this tentacled monster. And it has its tentacles gripping these different industries, like it's gripping around the shipping industry, it's gripping around the manufacturing and the factories and the workers, and it has tentacles around the Capitol building, and even maybe one that's about to, like, it looks like that tentacle's about to even grip the White House, saying that Standard Oil controlled not only the businesses and industries, but it was controlling the governments as well. And again, please remember, what is the government doing to stop these monopolies? Nothing. The government is standing back. That's called laissez-faire. Laissez-faire economics is where government believes that for an economy to prosper, it's best that the government leaves business alone. So it's from the French word that means, leave it be, or the hands-off approach. So if I do this again, hands off, government's not going to interfere. It's going to let the business do whatever it wants. And the reason why monopolies like Standard Oil are terrible, shown as like a monster here, is that while it will make some men like John D. Rockefeller or Andrew Carnegie super, super rich, obscenely wealthy, it's going to leave a lot of other people very poor. It's going to take advantage of these workers who are working long shifts for low wages in very unsafe, very, very highly dangerous environments. So workers are being exploited. That's one reason you would call a business leader a robber baron, because of their exploitation of their workers. And another reason is because of the negative effects this will have on consumers. When you form a monopoly, consumers are going to suffer because they will not have as many choices. If there's only one company, that's the only one you can go to. That also means that consumers will probably also have to pay more. And so consumers will suffer. And if consumers and workers are suffering, then while you might have a few rich people, your economy probably will not be growing in the long term. So in the long term, these robber barons and the monopolies that they formed, such as Standard Oil, also were not good for the United States as a whole, even if there were some short-term gains. All right. A few of the other captains of industry / robber barons you need to know about include guys like Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was a little bit earlier before Carnegie and Rockefeller. Vanderbilt built his fortune off the railroad companies. He started originally with the steamships and steam engines. You also need to know again about J.P. Morgan, the financier, the money bags, I called him. J.P. Morgan is the one of them that was not born poor. J.P. Morgan was born extremely rich from a banking family, and he will use his family's money to invest and take over many other industries. Like J.P. Morgan invests with Thomas Edison to help create General Electric. He also, like I said, will buy out Carnegie Steel to form U.S. Steel. And in the early 1900s, J.P. Morgan is so wealthy that he actually bails out the federal government during one of its panics, I think in 1907. So that's J.P. Morgan. And today you might know J.P. Morgan with like the J.P. Morgan Chase, the Chase banks. So Between 1880 and 1890, about 35,000 workers perished or died in factory and mining accidents each year. Again, life for most workers during the Gilded Age is going to be abysmal. It's going to be terrible. They are being exploited, and the government is doing nothing to protect workers. In the theory of the leisure class, the author basically focuses on the life of how these richest 1% of Americans, these captains of industry slash robber barons, live. And keep in mind, the term captain of industry or the term robber baron, they're almost interchangeable because they're both referring to these rich business leaders like Carnegie and Rockefeller. The only difference is how you see them. If you see them as somebody who is doing good works for society, helping build our economy and project America, as one of the great industrial nations of the world at this time, that they were a captain of industry. If you saw them as a person, a business leader who was exploiting or taking advantage of their workers and hurting consumers and America in general, then and ruthlessly cutting out the competition as they formed their monopolies, then they were known as a robber baron. Okay, so again, those terms for these business leaders, they're basically interchangeable. Please don't get confused by that. But anyway, in this book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, the life of the richest Americans was explored. And the theme throughout the book was basically about this new idea of conspicuous consumption, that these robber barons, they lived as kings and queens of Europe, building giant palatial mansions, and sometimes multiple homes throughout the country. They lived as royalty, basically, and they would spend on things that weren't necessities. They would spend just to spend money to show how much they had. That is conspicuous consumption, when you literally spend money to show off just how rich you are. It's kind of like being bougie. Like we'll talk about in the 1980s with like the yuppies. And you still see people like that today who want to show off how rich they are by buying a fancy sports car and then driving it real fast down Valley Mills in an obnoxious way. Don't ever do that, please. But yeah, that's conspicuous consumption. You want to show off your wealth. And they lived basically in closed communities and fancy uptown areas, totally isolated from the rest of America, who was pretty poor. There's a huge income inequality that develops in America in the Gilded Age, where the richest 1% of Americans are going to own more than the bottom half of the entire country's population. It's a very troubling idea, but it's something that doesn't get any better. In fact, in many ways today, we're living in a new Gilded Age where that wealth and income inequality is even worse. That the richest, Americans control much more in wealth and property than everybody else combined, which is ridiculous, and it doesn't leave a lot for the rest of us. A counterpoint to this book was, of course, from the muckraker journalist, the photojournalist, Jacob Riis. You should definitely know him and his book. I would highlight it as well, How the Other Half Lives. And it's just like the title suggests. In his book, How the Other Half Lives, Riis basically goes into the cities like New York City and Chicago, which by this time Chicago had developed into America's second largest city. Pittsburgh, Chicago, these Northwest cities are where you have the industrial belt taking place, with iron productions in Pittsburgh, and you have like the enormous stockyards in Chicago with the meatpacking industry taking off. But basically, How the Other Half Lives, Jacob Riis goes around taking pictures with these new portable, cameras. He takes pictures of the urban poor, especially the children who were living homeless in the city's gutters and alleyways, and many pictures of those people, those urban poor in the cities who were living in what's called a tenement. A lot of those people were immigrants, and these apartments that they lived in, called tenements, were the most wretched, crowded, filthy, unhygienic places you could imagine, where literally whole families with extended family were living in such a cramped space. You can imagine like a quarter of our classroom, a family of like 8 living in, sharing a communal bathroom with like everybody on the same floor. It was extremely crowded, extremely unsanitary. Many people would be living out in the hallways. Those were the tenements, the poor housing for a lot of these immigrants. And Jacob Riis wanted to show the rich, leisure, aristocratic, wealthy, royal, businessmen, this is how the rest of America is living. This is how the other half lives, kind of trying to wake them up. And we'll talk more about muckrakers later, but I want to throw out that word that basically a muckraker is a journalist who wants to expose the truth so that people are made aware of what is happening in society. All right, with all that being said, there is a picture of Jacob Riis from his book, How the Other Half Lives, of the tenements in American cities where the immigrants lived. And we are going to go ahead and stop there. Next time, we'll be talking about the American West at this time. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I will talk to you later. There we go. Bye.